This episode was suggested by Marie, Taylor Treat, and Annabelle. This episode includes discussions of colonialism, religious extremism, and abuse of women and children. If these topics are triggers for you, this might be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Stories of witchcraft accusations, trials, and executions of the past have captured the human imagination for centuries. One of the most well-known incidents of mass accusation and execution for witchcraft occurred in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The Salem witch trials are so captivating that they've been covered in hundreds of documentaries, books, and podcasts, and used as a backdrop to tell fictional stories by the hundreds. Many interpretations have unfortunately taken liberties with the facts, as is often the case in literature and art. The facts become muddled up with the stories, and some untangling is necessary in order to understand what exactly happened in that small community that resulted in 19 executions. At the center of the Salem witch trials was a group of young women, ranging in age from 9 to 20, who screamed, writhed, barked, and displayed other disturbing symptoms. Often referred to as the afflicted girls, they included members of prominent village families, as well as domestic servants. When their fathers, husbands, or employers couldn't find an explanation for their behavior, witchcraft became the explanation. Before we dive into the Salem witch trials, a little historical context is needed for both the beliefs surrounding witchcraft at the time and the history of the Salem area. For a deeper look into the background of both the afflicted girls and the accused witches, I did an episode just for patrons about this, which is accessible by becoming a patron for as little as $2 a month. There are 3 consistent factors that come into play in most instances of witch panics. The first is Christianity and its ideology of the witch as a servant of Satan. Second is interpersonal tensions between villagers, such as spats between neighbors or factions in a small town. The third is gender. Theological decrees, judicial laws, and court systems were all written and controlled by males. If a woman wasn't acting the way the male authorities thought decent and natural, she was likely to be accused of witchcraft. From about 1400 to 1775 CE, around 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft in Europe and British colonial America. Between 40 and 60,000 were executed, almost all in Europe. Roughly 80% of those convicted of witchcraft were women, most of them over 40 years old. In some regions, convicted witches were burnt at the stake, the traditional punishment for religious heresy. During the 1430s, the concept of witches as servants of the devil came into being. Witches suddenly became a threat to the Christian foundations of society. The concept further evolved to include that witches were not isolated individuals, but members of a demonic, anti-Christian, heretical cult. The most influential book to promote this new concept was the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by clergyman and German inquisitor Heinrich Kramer and Jacobus Sprenger. Malleus Maleficarum, which means witch hammer, addressed many aspects of witches, including magic, a witch's origin, and appropriate punishment for witches. The book was so popular at the time that it was published over 30 times between 1487 and 1669, all over Europe. It was widely regarded by many lay people to be the irrefutable truth, thanks to a statement in the beginning of the book that said all who doubt the existence of witches were in opposition to the church and were therefore heretics. Major concerns over religious conformity resulted in the Protestant Reformation, which became officially visible in England in 1529, when Henry VIII disagreed with Pope Clement VII on the question of marriage annulment. During Henry VIII's son's reign, King Edward VI, Protestantism was established as the official religion in England. However, during Queen Mary I's reign, which began only 24 years later in 1553, Edward's Protestant reforms were reversed in a Catholic counter-reformation. This resurgence in Catholicism included the exiling of Protestant populations, heresy trials, and the creation of the Inquisition. Queen Mary I became known as Bloody Mary for her intense persecution of Protestants. When Elizabeth I took over the throne 5 years later, she restored England to Protestantism and worked to suppress Catholicism. During this religious upheaval, both Catholics and Protestants attempted to validate their theological views by performing exorcisms and persecuting witches. The general population was forced to adopt the official religion of the crown, and therefore were expected to conform to whatever sect was in power at the time, making for a very confusing 50 years or so. An extreme sect of Protestants, known as Puritans by their opposition, believed that the Church of England still wasn't Protestant enough. Puritans were considered religious extremists who believed that most humans were born sinners and deserved damnation. Only a select few, known as the elect, would be chosen by God to be saved. The rest had to fight for their salvation through a process called conversion, which involved introspection, Bible study, listening to sermons, humiliation, self-restraint, and penitence. Once the person realized that salvation was only possible due to divine mercy, they would be considered born again as part of the elect. From 1629 to 1640, many Puritans left for the Massachusetts Bay Colony in New England and other British colonial settlements along the coast of North America. By 1641, around 21,000 Puritans had moved across the Atlantic. This population produced more than 16 million descendants, and because those descendants were of a Puritan background, those values became the basis for New England society. While the witch panic began to fade out in Europe during the 17th century, it blossomed in North America and more remote regions of Europe. The 1692 Salem witch trials were a brief outburst of witch panic. The original town of Salem was a coastal city in what is now Essex County, Massachusetts. Settlement by Europeans began in 1626, but European explorers had made contact with the indigenous peoples before that. Native Americans lived in the area for thousands of years before European colonization. The peninsula was known as Naumkeag by the indigenous peoples who lived there at the time. Naumkeag was a major settlement territory for one group of indigenous peoples, called the Naumkeag people by the colonists. The initial contact period was disastrous for the Naumkeag. They'd just ended a bloody war with another tribe when contact with European explorers resulted in a smallpox epidemic that killed their great leader, Nanepashemet. In 1633, a second smallpox epidemic struck, killing 2 of Nanepashemet's successors. Because of this, the English colonists were met with very little resistance at first. During the King Philip's War in 1675, the Naumkeag joined another tribe against the English, but by that time, there were so many settlers that they were easily defeated. In 1686, the indigenous peoples of Naumkeag began to assert their claim to the peninsula, often attacking English settlements along the coast. Between 1689 and 1692, the attacks were so frequent and bloody that many English settlements along the Maine coast were abandoned, resulting in a flood of refugees into areas like Essex County. The people of Salem would have been anxious not only about attacks by indigenous peoples, but also newcomers crowding into their small town. Salem itself was known at the time for its tense social environment. Salem Village, which is present-day Danvers, had a rocky relationship with Salem Town, which is present-day Salem. The main disputes surrounded property lines, animal grazing rights, and church privileges. The rapid population growth would have made the situation even more tense. The disputes about church privileges and property rights were the most heated. In 1672, the villagers of Salem Village voted to hire their own minister, as it was a long way to travel to Salem Town to attend sermons. The first 2 ministers they chose stayed only a few years, as the congregation failed to pay them their full rate. Their third choice was Reverend Samuel Parris, and on June 18, 1689, a majority of villagers agreed to hire Parris, despite controversy over the matter. On October 10, 1689, a committee of villagers decided to raise his pay and grant him a parsonage and 2 acres of land. This decision conflicted with a 1681 village resolution which prohibited the village from giving a house, lands, or other church property to anyone. Reverend Parris increased Salem Village's divisions by deliberately seeking out, quote, iniquitous behavior, end quote, in his congregation, and made church members in good standing suffer public penance for small infractions. In October of 1691, 1 year before the witch accusations began, at a Salem Village town meeting, members of the anti-Parris faction of the growing Salem Village church conflict resolved to stop paying Reverend Parris. They wanted a more moderate reverend, a closer association with Salem Town, and its rise as a new international port. The pro-Parris faction wanted more separation from Salem Town and approved of Parris's strict Puritan views. After the meeting, Parris began to preach about a satanic conspiracy in Salem Town against him and the church. Also in October of 1691, a new charter for the enlarged colony, now called the Province of Massachusetts Bay, was approved in England. Increase Mather, a Puritan clergyman and politician, had been working on the charter for 4 years with William Phips, an adventurer who had previously helped Mather oust his political adversary. As part of Mather's charter, Phips was appointed governor of Boston. Mather also handpicked most of the members of the council. One of the first acts of this new government was nominating county justices of the peace and sheriffs and commissioning a special court of oyer and terminer, an older name for criminal court. This assured that the laws were written and upheld by men with Puritan values. Though they were thought to be equal in the eyes of God, Puritan men and women were held to very different expectations. A Puritan woman was expected to marry, have children, and manage their husband's household. They were legally and economically under their husband's control and expected to be submissive to them. They were also expected to be authoritative over their children, but also make them a priority over themselves. They were expected to grow, gather and cook food, make and repair clothing, and care for the children. Women who didn't conform to Puritan societal norms were the biggest targets of witchcraft accusations, especially outspoken, unmarried, or childless women. Many Puritan women who were accused of witchcraft confessed. Due to a lifetime of Puritan doctrine, many truly believed they had given in to the devil and deserved punishment. Admission of guilt was also the route of least resistance, as those who confessed often served penitence, were forgiven, and then reintegrated back into society. Disagreements and feuds with neighbors often resulted in accusations, but most of the time the accusations were dismissed. That is, until February of 1692. In Salem Village, Reverend Parris's 9-year-old daughter Betty and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams began to have what were described as fits. Between January and mid-February, they periodically screamed, threw things around the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. Reverend John Hale of nearby Beverly Village described the affliction, stating that the girls moved as if they, quote, were bitten and pinched by invisible agents. Their arms, necks, and backs turned this way and that way and returned back again, so as it was impossible for them to do of themselves, and beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural diseases to effect. Sometimes they were taken dumb, their mouths stopped, their throats choked, their limbs racked and tormented, so as might move a heart of stone to sympathize with them." End quote. The girls complained of being pinched and pricked with pins. The village physician, Dr. William Griggs, was called to examine them. Dr. Griggs' educational background is unclear, but as he was practicing in early colonial New England, it's unlikely he had any formal medical training or was aware of the medical advances in Europe. Women were generally responsible for caring for the sick in Puritan society. However, when an illness was unusual or persistent, physicians, who were all male at the time, were sought to examine patients. If the physician was unable to explain the cause of the illness, witchcraft was usually suspected and considered a valid diagnosis. Griggs found no physical evidence of any ailment, so suggested the girls were being afflicted by witchcraft. Other young women in the village began to exhibit similar behaviors. 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. and 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard convulsed and screamed, reporting terrible attacks from invisible specters and apparitions. On February 29th, the afflicted girls began to name their spectral assailants. Before we get into the accusations, an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can access ad-free episodes of the MCP by becoming a patron at the lowest tier, $2 a month, by going to bit.ly/morbidpatron. That's bit.ly/morbidpatron. On February 29, 1692, the afflicted girls accused Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and an enslaved woman named Tituba of harming them by invisible means. Sarah Good was a destitute woman who was targeted because of her reputation. At her trial, she was accused of rejecting Puritan ideals of self-control and discipline. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church meetings, and at her trial, she was accused of having her own self-interests in mind when it came to her previous husband's inheritance. Tituba, who served the Paris family, was likely targeted because of her ethnic differences. Each woman was a social outcast and exhibited many of the character traits typical of the usual suspects for witchcraft accusations. Because the word of 4 young girls wasn't enough to begin official investigations, written complaints were registered with the magistrates for the accused to be questioned and/or imprisoned. Before the panic spread beyond Salem village, most of the written complaints were lodged by the brothers Thomas and John Putnam. Thomas Putnam was one of the wealthiest residents of Salem and was the first to seek warrants against accused witches. The Putnams were supporters of Reverend Paris and also had property disputes with several of the accused. Thomas wrote many of the depositions for the afflicted, including his daughter Ann Putnam Jr. As a highly influential church member, he was one of the driving forces behind the trials. Starting on March 1st, the accused women were brought before local magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin on the complaint of witchcraft, with no one to defend them but themselves. Over several days of interrogation, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne maintained their innocence, but under extreme pressure, Tituba confessed and named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as her accomplices. She also said that there were more witches, but she didn't know their names. The 3 women were jailed. Though Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and Elizabeth Hubbard seemed to recover after the initial suspects were brought into custody, Ann Putnam Jr. continued to suffer fits. On March 3rd, she claimed to see the specters of Martha Corey, Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, and Elizabeth Proctor tormenting her. 10 days later, Ann Putnam Jr. saw another specter, an unknown older woman sitting in her grandmother's chair. Her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., and the Putnams' 17-year-old servant, Mercy Lewis, tried to help her identify the specter. Eventually, Ann Jr. named the specter as elderly Salem town resident Rebecca Nurse. Soon after, Mercy Lewis fell into regular fits as well. On March 18th, Ann Putnam Sr. fell into a fit and claimed she was being spectrally tormented. She was the only adult among the small group of afflicted women. During late March, Martha Corey, Dorothy Good, Rebecca Nurse, and Rachel Clinton of nearby Ipswich were arrested on accusation of witchcraft. They were all interrogated by magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin. Martha Corey had expressed skepticism about the credibility of the girls' accusations, and thus drawn their ire. 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse firmly maintained her innocence, but the afflicted girls, who were present during the examination, convinced the magistrates to hold her for trial. The charges against Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey deeply troubled the Salem community, as they were both fully covenanted members of the church. If such upstanding people could be witches, anybody could be a witch. Church membership offered no protection from accusation. At the beginning of April, Abigail Williams claimed to be tormented by the specter of Elizabeth Proctor. John Proctor, Elizabeth's husband, was an outspoken skeptic of the affliction. When his own servant, 20-year-old Mary Warren, began to have fits, he didn't believe a word of it. In this environment, Mary's fits eventually ceased. She posted a note on the meeting house door requesting prayers of thanks for her recovery, and the questions asked of her afterward seemed to indicate a rise in skepticism in all the girls' afflictions. Mary Warren herself was the next person accused of witchcraft by the afflicted girls. Elizabeth and John Proctor and Sarah Cloyce, Rebecca Nurse's sister, were arrested and cross-examined. During the examination, the afflicted claimed that both Elizabeth and her husband were tormenting them and appeared to be violently afflicted. Both the Proctors and Sarah Cloyce were held for trial. In mid-April, Bridget Bishop, Deliverance and Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Giles Corey were arrested. During their cross-examination, Abigail Hobbs confessed to signing the Devil's Book and becoming a witch. Deliverance Hobbs followed suit. Soon after, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Mary Walcott accused Sarah Wilds, William Hobbs, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., Mary Easty, two relatives of Bridget Bishop, Mary Black, and Mary English of witchcraft. Mary Easty was accused after defending her sister, Rebecca Nurse. At the end of April, Dorcas Hoar, Lydia Dustin, George Burroughs, Susanna Martin, Sarah Morell, and Philip English were arrested as suspected witches. Reverend George Burroughs was the minister of Salem Village before Reverend Paris, and was suspected by many of being at the center of the outbreak of witchcraft. Philip English and his wife fled Salem in secret before they could both be arrested. On May 10, 1692, Sarah Osborne died in jail. The conditions inside were appalling: dirt floors, few lights or windows, damp and lice-ridden. Prisoners were bound in ropes and chains, subjected to endless examinations by clergymen and magistrates, insulted by those who came to gawk at them, and brought meager meals that they had to pay for. Several more people were arrested in May: Margaret Jacobs and George Jacobs Sr., granddaughter and grandfather. Margaret accused her grandfather and George Burroughs during her examination. John Willard, who was a constable in Salem, was accused after refusing to arrest people he believed were innocent. Ann Pudeator and Alice Parker were also arrested. On May 14th, Increase Mather arrived in Boston, bearing the new charter and the new governor. Because the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter had been revoked in 1684, the colony had been operating in a kind of legal limbo. Until this point, only pre-trial examinations had occurred to determine if there was enough evidence against the accused to warrant a trial. With the arrival of the new charter, the court of Oyer and Terminer could assemble and bring the accused to trial. This was a priority as the jails were overflowing with people accused of witchcraft. The Boston jail had to request additional shackles for prisoners. They were loaned the money for this purchase by Samuel Sewell, a relation of Reverend Parris. During the second half of May, Dr. Roger Toothacker and several of the proctor's children and relatives were arrested. Wilmot Redd, Martha Carrier, Thomas Farrer, Elizabeth Hart, Elizabeth Jackson, Mary Toothacker, Margaret Toothacker, who was only 9, John Alden Jr., Elizabeth Fosdick, and Elizabeth Payne were all accused of witchcraft and arrested. At this point, Cotton Mather wrote a letter to Judge John Richards to advise him on how the court should proceed with the witchcraft cases. Mather cautioned against using spectral evidence in court, but ultimately left it up to the magistrates. Spectral evidence was any testimony claiming that an apparition or demon in the shape of a known person had attacked someone and that that person was responsible. Supporters of spectral evidence said the devil needed permission to use a person's form, making them complicit in the attacks. Opponents claimed that the devil could use anyone's form without permission, so the form the apparition took couldn't be used as evidence. Unfortunately, the opponents were in the minority. On June 2nd, Bridget Bishop was the first to be brought to trial by grand jury. William Stoughton, the new lieutenant governor, served as chief magistrate, Thomas Newton as the Crown's attorney prosecuting the case, and Stephen Sewell as clerk. 7 judges were appointed by Governor Phipps: Bartholomew Gedney, John Hawthorne, Nathaniel Saltonstall, William Sargent, Samuel Sewell, and Waitstill Winthrop. Around the time of the first trial by grand jury, several of the accused women were subjected to a body search by a male doctor and several female nurses. They were looking for witch marks, also called witches' teats or devil's marks. Any small skin defect, such as a scar, a mole, or a skin tag, could have been identified as a witch mark. This flexibility of definition made it so any mark on the skin could be construed as a witch's mark, and this was counted as evidence against the accused. Other dubious types of evidence that were allowed in witchcraft cases included anger followed by mischief, spectral evidence, and confession. Anger followed by mischief was any incident in which the suspected witch was angered by someone and then that person suffered some sort of mishap, such as injury, illness, or crop failure. As I said before, spectral evidence was any claim that an apparition or demon in the shape of the accused had harmed one of the afflicted, and confession was the accused's own admission of being influenced by the devil. Because witchcraft didn't require the accused to be physically present at the scene, there was no alibi, no real defense against the accusations. Because it was believed that it was impossible for anyone other than the afflicted to perceive the spectral attacks, witnesses were called to testify to the motives of the accused and the effects of their supposed witchcraft. Various acts of torture were used against the accused witches to coerce confessions and force them to name their alleged co-conspirators. On top of allowing such questionable evidence, the afflicted were present in the courtroom during the trials. Court records include time gaps in which the afflicted threw themselves on the ground, screamed, and cried out in pain, usually in response to movements or statements made by the accused. The most reactive of the afflicted were Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, and Ann Putnam, Jr. On June 8th, Bridget Bishop was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to execution. one of the judges resigned soon after, presumably in protest of the court procedures. Bridget Bishop and anyone else found guilty would be executed by hanging. In part 2 of this episode, I'm going to discuss the spread of the witch panic from Salem village to the surrounding villages. I'll also talk about the executions, torture, and incarceration of the accused witches, and then the possible explanations put forth by modern historians and medical professionals for why this panic may have occurred. If you're interested in the details of this case, there are 3 books I would recommend. One is The Devil in the Shape of a Woman by Carol Carlson. Another is 6 Women of Salem by Mary Lynn Roach. And the last is Salem Possessed, The Social Origins of Witchcraft by Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum. There are hundreds of other great books out there on this topic, but these are the 3 that I found the most useful. Until part 2, keep tending to your spark of morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Poppy E., Elizabeth S., Pazuzu, Apostle Arose, Amanda C., and Steph H. all have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons. Thank you so much. And hello to all of the new free members of Patreon. It's nice to see you there. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.